It was one of those golden afternoons that seemed almost magical, where the sunlight bathed everything in warmth, and the gentle hum of life filled the air. The city's Central Park was alive with activity. Children laughed as they chased one another across the open grass. Families gathered around picnic blankets sharing stories and snacks, and couples strolled hand in hand along the winding paths. The sound of a street performer's guitar blended with the soft rustle of leaves as a light breeze rippled across the emerald surface of the park's serene lake. Everywhere you looked, there was joy, energy, and movement, but not everywhere. In a far corner of the park, away from the hustle and bustle, sat a man who seemed untouched by the beauty and life around him. The sunlight didn't reach this secluded spot, where the air seemed heavier, quieter, perched on a weathered wooden bench that had seen better days. The man sat motionless, as if he were part of the bench itself. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed slightly, and his eyes, clouded with sorrow, stared into the distance, as if searching for something he had lost long ago. In front of him lay a battered piece of cardboard, propped up against his knees. The writing on it was uneven, shaky, as though written with hands unsteady from years of hardship. The words were simple but heavy. "I once served this country. Now, I just ask for a little kindness." The man's name was Mark. Once, he had been a soldier, a member of the elite special forces. On the battlefield, he had been celebrated as a hero, admired for his courage and his willingness to face danger head-on to protect the freedoms of his nation. His actions had saved lives, and his name had been spoken with pride by those who had fought alongside him. But wars don't just leave scars on the battlefield. When Mark returned home, he found himself a stranger in his own country. The world he had fought to protect seemed to have moved on without him. The applause and gratitude faded, and in their place came the silence of isolation. The battles he had left behind overseas had been replaced by new battles within himself, ones he couldn't fight with weapons or strategy. The memories of war haunted him at night. The faces of comrades he couldn't save lingered in his mind, and the physical pain from old injuries was a constant reminder of what he had endured. Over time, those invisible wounds began to consume him. The toll was heavy. His family, unable to navigate the storm of his inner struggles, drifted away. His career, once filled with purpose and pride, fell apart as the weight of his mental and physical scars became too much to bear. Piece by piece, his life unraveled until he was left with nothing, with nowhere else to go. Mark sought refuge on the streets. For years, he had survived on the outskirts of society, relying on the occasional kindness of strangers. Yet even that was rare. Most people passed him by without a second glance, their eyes deliberately avoiding his, as if acknowledging him would somehow make his pain contagious. That's how it was in the park that day. Amidst the laughter, the joy, and the liveliness, Mark sat invisible. People walked past him as if he didn't exist, as if he were just another forgotten fixture of the park, a worn-out bench, a pile of fallen leaves. He didn't ask for much. He didn't need pity, nor did he expect it. All he wanted was a moment, just one fleeting moment, where someone might look at him and see him, not as a failure, but as a person who had once mattered. A glance of empathy, a kind word, a smile. It wasn't much, but for Mark, it would have been everything. It would have reminded him that, even after all he had lost, he was still human, that he still had value. But the people in the park that afternoon didn't see him, or, more accurately, they chose not to. And so, Mark sat in silence, staring into the distance, resigned to his invisibility. Yet, as the golden light of the afternoon began to shift with the descending sun, something unexpected was about to happen. For Mark, it would be the moment that changed everything, a moment he could never have anticipated. Not far from where Mark Saturday, a man named Richard strolled confidently through the park, accompanied by his impeccably dressed family. Richard's tailored suit fit him like a glove, and his polished leather shoes gleamed in the sunlight. On his wrist, a luxury watch caught the light, flashing with each movement of his hand. Everything about him screamed wealth and status, and he carried himself with an air of superiority that seemed to demand attention. As he walked, heads turned, not out of admiration, but because his presence radiated arrogance. He relished it. As Richard surveyed the park, his gaze eventually landed on Mark. The sight of the disheveled veteran sitting quietly with his cardboard sign seemed to ignite something ugly in him. His steps faltered, and then he stopped abruptly, the sharp tap of his shoes on the pavement slicing through the ambient park sounds. Richard's face twisted into an expression of contempt so stark it was almost theatrical. He stood still for a moment, taking in Mark's hunched posture, his worn clothes, and the sign resting against his knees. Then, as if performing for an audience, Richard squared his shoulders and stepped closer, his voice booming loud enough for the surrounding people to hear. "You claim to have served this country, and now here you are, sitting on a park bench begging for money? What an absolute disgrace." The words cut through the cheerful chatter of the park like a blade. People nearby turned their heads in curiosity, their conversations falling silent as they watched the scene unfold. Sensing he had drawn a crowd, Richard leaned into his performance. His voice grew even louder, dripping with mockery and disdain. "Men like you, if you were truly capable, would never end up in this situation. Don't blame the war. Don't blame society. Blame yourself. You're lazy. That's all you are. A lazy burden to this country." Richard's words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and biting. The crowd began to gather more closely, their faces a mix of reactions. A few people chuckled nervously, as though unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable, but no one stepped forward to challenge Richard. They simply stood there, watching, as if his cruel words weren't enough. Richard decided to punctuate his performance with an action that left no doubt about his disdain. He reached into the pocket of his pristine suit and pulled out a small coin, holding it up for everyone to see. He rolled it between his fingers, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. For a brief moment, he seemed to consider the coin's worth, as though debating whether the act of charity he was about to perform was even worth the effort. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the coin onto the pavement at Mark's feet. The coin hit the ground with a cold, metallic clink, the sound ringing out louder than it should have in the sudden hush. "Here," Richard sneered, his voice thick with mock generosity. "Take this and buy yourself something. But don't forget, it's my charity that's helping you today." Straightening his posture, Richard adjusted the cuffs of his suit and looked around, clearly expecting some kind of approval from the crowd. He smirked, as though his actions were the epitome of magnanimity, a display of his so-called kindness. His expression said it all. He believed he had just performed a noble deed. Meanwhile, Mark remained still. His hands, thin and weathered, clutched the edges of his cardboard sign tightly. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the effort it took to suppress the storm of emotions that swirled inside him. His face gave nothing away, but inside, he was battling humiliation, frustration, and sorrow. He had endured this kind of cruelty before. It was nothing new, but repetition didn't dull the sting. Each word, each gesture, was another wound layered atop the others, another weight pressing down on his already burdened soul. The crowd, still gathered, reacted in fractured ways. Some people chuckled awkwardly, as though unsure whether Richard's mockery was meant to be funny. A few nodded in agreement, their faces hard with judgment, but most stood silent, their unease written plainly on their faces. None of them, however, moved to intervene. Not one person stepped forward to defend Mark's dignity. For a moment, it seemed as though Mark's humiliation would go unanswered, left to linger in the air like an unpleasant odor. Richard, satisfied with his display, turned his gaze to his family, clearly ready to move on. But what Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that they were not the only ones watching. From a distance, a pair of sharp, perceptive eyes had been taking in the entire scene. Eyes that missed nothing. Eyes that belonged to a man with both the power and the willingness to act. Unbeknownst to Richard, the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, and the man who was about to step forward would change everything in a way no one could have predicted. In the golden glow of the late afternoon, the city park was alive with activity. The rustling leaves swayed gently in the breeze, and the sun painted streaks of light through the canopy of trees. Families strolled along the winding paths. Children darted across the grass in fits of laughter, and couples shared quiet conversations on wooden benches. Amid this picturesque scene, a small entourage moved gracefully down one of the park's main pathways. At the center of the group was Donald Trump, the former president of the United States. Trump carried himself with the authority of someone who was used to commanding attention, yet his demeanor was unexpectedly calm, as though he were taking a rare moment to enjoy the serenity of his surroundings. But serenity has a way of being disrupted, and it wasn't long before Trump's sharp eyes caught sight of something unusual in the distance, a commotion that pulled him away from his tranquil stroll. From his vantage point, Trump could see everything clearly. A man in a finely tailored suit, gesturing dramatically, standing over another man seated on a worn bench. The seated man held a tattered cardboard sign, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed low. Even at this distance, the tension in the air was palpable. Trump's expression shifted. His gaze hardened as he observed the scene unfolding before him. He didn't need to hear the words being exchanged to understand what was happening. The arrogance in the posture of the standing man and the defeated stillness of the one on the bench told him enough. Trump's steps slowed as he took in the sight of Richard, the wealthy onlooker berating Mark, a downtrodden veteran, while the crowd watched in silent complicity. For a moment, Trump stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowed in thought. Then, with a swift decision, he began moving again, this time with purpose. As Trump approached the gathering, the lively chatter of the park seemed to fade. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and heads turned one by one as people recognized the figure walking toward the center of the commotion. The effect was immediate. The crowd instinctively parted, creating a clear path for him. His presence alone carried the weight of authority, and the murmurs that followed in his wake were filled with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Richard, still engrossed in his tirade, had yet to notice the approaching figure. He gestured toward Mark, his voice dripping with disdain as he delivered yet another cutting remark. "People like you," Richard sneered, loud enough for the onlookers to hear, "should stop blaming others for your failures. This country gave you opportunities, you just squandered them. Don't expect anyone to feel sorry for you." The words cut through the air, but before they could settle, another voice rose above them, steadier, deeper, and commanding enough to silence everything else. "What did you just say to this man?" The question carried a weight that demanded an immediate response. Richard turned abruptly, startled. His confident demeanor faltered the moment his eyes met Trump's. The former president's gaze was sharp and unyielding, his posture radiating an unspoken authority. Richard froze, his face flushing as recognition dawned on him. He blinked, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to compose himself under the intense scrutiny of not just Trump, but the growing crowd now fixated on the interaction. I was just speaking the truth," Richard finally stammered, forcing a nervous smile as he tried to mask his discomfort. People like him should stand up for themselves instead of sitting there, waiting for handouts. Trump didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Richard with a piercing gaze that seemed to strip away the man's carefully constructed facade. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and Richard began to fidget under the weight of Trump's stare. The crowd, sensing the tension, held its collective breath, waiting for what would come next. Finally, Trump shifted his attention away from Richard and turned toward Mark. The veteran hadn't moved, his hands still clutching the edges of his sign. His face remained lowered, his eyes fixed on the ground. Slowly, Trump knelt down beside him, bringing himself to eye level with the man who had been the target of so much disdain. Reaching out, Trump placed a firm but gentle hand on Mark's shoulder. The gesture was simple, yet it carried with it a sense of solidarity and reassurance. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter but filled with genuine kindness. "What's your name, my friend?" Mark hesitated, his fingers tightening around the sign as though it were a lifeline. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, his weary eyes meeting Trump's. There was no judgment in Trump's expression, only a warmth that seemed to cut through the layers of shame and exhaustion Mark carried with him. "Mark," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Mark, sir." Trump nodded slightly, offering a small smile of acknowledgement. "Mark," he continued, "where did you serve?" The question hung in the air, drawing the attention of the entire crowd. Mark hesitated again, the weight of so many eyes on him making it difficult to speak. But there was something in Trump's tone, an authenticity, a sincerity that made it easier. "I served in the Special Forces," Mark said, his voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with each word. "I fought overseas, but when I came back, I lost everything. My family, my job, even my home. I have nothing left." Trump listened intently, his hand never leaving Mark's shoulder. When Mark finished speaking, Trump gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, a silent gesture of encouragement. Rising to his full height, Trump turned back to face the now silent crowd. His eyes swept over the gathering, his expression resolute. "This man," Trump began, his voice carrying the weight of conviction, "is a hero. He risked his life to defend the freedoms that all of us enjoy today. While he was out there fighting, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about this country. He was thinking about you and your families." The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap, shattering the tension and replacing it with a collective sense of reflection. People who had looked at Mark with indifference, or worse, disdain, just moments ago now found themselves shifting uncomfortably under the weight of their own judgment. And then Trump turned his attention back to Richard. Trump turned to face Richard, his sharp, commanding gaze slicing through the arrogant facade of the wealthy man like a knife through paper. The weight of his stare alone seemed to strip away the confidence Richard had worn so proudly only moments earlier. Standing tall, Trump's voice rang out, deep and resolute, carrying with it both strength and a restrained warmth that made it impossible to ignore. "Do you have any idea what this man has done for our country? While you were sitting in the comfort of your office, enjoying safety and luxury, he was on the front lines, where every step could have been his last. He didn't fight for himself. He fought for freedom, not just for you but for your family as well. And this is how you repay him?" The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The vibrant energy of the park seemed to dissipate, replaced by an almost suffocating silence. Those who had earlier laughed or nodded in agreement with Richard's taunts now found themselves unable to meet anyone's gaze. Heads lowered, and expressions softened into something akin to shame. The sting of Trump's words cut not just through Richard, but through everyone who had stood by in quiet complicity. Richard, who had been so full of pride only moments before, now shifted uncomfortably. His hands fidgeted with the buttons on his tailored jacket as he avoided Trump's intense stare. His face flushed a deep red, and the confident smirk he had worn earlier was now nowhere to be seen. Taking a deep breath, Trump turned away from Richard and walked slowly toward Mark. Each step he took seemed deliberate, measured, as though he were fully aware of the gravity of the moment. When he reached Mark, he didn't stand towering over him. Instead, he lowered himself onto the bench beside the veteran, his imposing presence softening into something far more human, placing a firm but gentle hand on Mark's shoulder. Trump looked him directly in the eye. His voice, though quieter now, carried a depth of respect that resonated with everyone within earshot. "Mark, you have sacrificed more for this country than most people can ever imagine. You've given so much, and yet you've been left to carry this burden alone. That's not right. This country owes you, and it's time we gave you back what you rightfully deserve." Mark hesitated for a moment, as if the weight of years of neglect and humiliation made it difficult for him to process what was happening. Slowly, he lifted his head, his weary eyes meeting Trump's empathetic gaze. Tears welled up in Mark's eyes, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of validation he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was being seen, not as a failure, not as a forgotten man on a park bench, but as a human being, as a hero. Trump gave Mark's shoulder a reassuring squeeze before rising to his full height. Turning to his aides, who stood at the edge of the crowd, he spoke with the same tone of unwavering resolve that had marked his tenure as a leader. "I want to know everything about him, where he's been, what he needs, and what we can do to help. By the end of today, I want him in a decent place to live, and find him a good job, not just any job, but an opportunity to rebuild his life." The aides nodded quickly, their phones already in hand as they began making calls. Trump wasn't done. Reaching into his wallet, he pulled out a thick stack of cash and turned back to Mark. Kneeling slightly, he placed the money firmly into Mark's hands. His voice, warm but resolute, carried a message that seemed to echo beyond just the two of them. "Mark, this isn't charity. This is gratitude, from me, from this country, and from every single person who enjoys their freedom because of your sacrifices." Mark stared at the money in his hands, his fingers trembling as he clutched it tightly. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He simply nodded, his lips pressing together as he fought to contain the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. For a moment, the crowd remained silent, stunned by the weight of what they had just witnessed. Then, almost hesitantly, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was faint at first, but soon it grew louder as others joined in, the applause swelling into a thunderous ovation. People who had once looked at Mark with disdain or indifference now gazed at him with something far different: respect. Genuine, unfiltered respect. Some of the onlookers stepped forward, digging into their wallets and purses to place money into Mark's worn-out hat, which rested beside him on the bench. Each gesture, though small, carried with it a sense of newfound compassion. Trump's words had awakened something within them, a reminder of the humanity they had momentarily forgotten. Richard, meanwhile, stood frozen in place. The crowd's applause felt like a judgment being passed on him, each clap striking at the arrogance he had displayed just moments ago. His face flushed red with embarrassment, and he looked down at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, he stepped forward. Richard began, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak louder. "I was wrong. I'm sorry for what I said and did." Mark looked up at him, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else, something softer. Forgiveness. After a moment, Mark gave a small nod, a silent acceptance of the apology. The crowd watched in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. In that brief exchange, it wasn't just Mark's life that had shifted. Everyone who had been there, who had witnessed Trump's words and actions, walked away changed in some small but meaningful way. Before leaving, Trump paused mid-step. He turned slowly to face the crowd that had gathered, his commanding presence drawing the attention of every person in the park. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the scene, its warm light filtering through the trees and illuminating the faces of those who had stopped to witness the extraordinary moment. Trump's gaze swept over the crowd, his expression resolute yet touched by an unmistakable depth of emotion. He took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and resonant, carrying an undeniable authority, but also the warmth of a heartfelt lesson. The Bible teaches us, love your neighbor as yourself. It's one of the simplest, yet most powerful commandments we've been given. Men like Mark have lived that principle in ways most of us could never imagine. They've given everything to defend our freedom. They've put their lives on the line so that we could enjoy the safety and opportunity that so many of us take for granted. His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with truth. The crowd stood in complete silence, their eyes fixed on Trump, as though afraid to miss a single word. Trump continued, his tone growing more impassioned. Never forget the debt of gratitude we owe them. Without their sacrifice, without their courage, we wouldn't have what we enjoy today, the freedom to walk through this park, to laugh with our families, to pursue our dreams. Everything we have comes at a cost, and men like Mark have paid that cost for us. As he spoke, his gaze shifted briefly to Mark, who still sat on the bench, his head bowed slightly. But this time, Mark's posture was different. There was no longer the same weight of defeat in his shoulders. Instead, there was a quiet dignity, as though Trump's words had lifted some of the invisible burden he had been carrying for so long. Trump's words weren't just a rebuke to those who had mocked Mark, they were a call to action, a challenge to everyone present to examine their own hearts. As the former president's voice carried through the park, the crowd began to shift uncomfortably. The indifference and judgment that had filled their expressions earlier were replaced by something softer: reflection, humility, and, for many, a sense of regret. A woman near the front of the crowd wiped away a tear, her gaze fixed on Mark. A young father standing nearby tightened his grip on the hand of his son, as though suddenly reminded of the sacrifices others had made to secure the life he cherished. Even those who had laughed earlier now stood with downcast eyes, their faces etched with the weight of Trump's words. The park had fallen so silent that even the distant sound of children playing seemed muted, as though the entire world had paused to absorb the gravity of what was unfolding. Turning his attention back to the crowd, Trump's voice grew quieter, but it lost none of its intensity. The measure of a nation isn't in its wealth or power. It's in how we treat those who've given us the gift of freedom. It's in the respect we show to those who've sacrificed, and the compassion we extend to those in need. He let the words sink in, scanning the crowd for a moment before continuing. I'm not asking for pity. Mark doesn't need pity. What he, and so many others like him, deserve is respect, opportunity, and a chance to rebuild their lives. That's not charity. That's justice. And it's a debt we owe, not just as individuals, but as a society. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath, the weight of his message pressing against them like a physical force. It wasn't often that a simple afternoon in the park turned into something so profound, so transformative. As Trump turned back toward Mark, a small, hesitant clap broke the silence. It came from an older man in the back of the crowd, his face lined with emotion. Then another joined, and another, until the applause swelled into a wave of sound that seemed to envelop the park. It wasn't the raucous cheer of celebration. It was something quieter, more reverent, filled with respect and acknowledgement. Trump gave Mark one final nod, his eyes conveying a message that words couldn't capture. The veteran, now sitting a little taller, met his gaze with a small but genuine smile. Around them, the crowd began to shift, not to leave, but to approach. A man reached into his pocket and placed a few bills in Mark's hat. A young woman crouched down, gently touching Mark's arm as she whispered something softly. One by one, people stepped forward, not out of pity, but out of a genuine desire to show their gratitude. For the first time in years, Mark wasn't invisible, and for the first time in years, he believed he might still have a place in the world. And the park, which had begun the afternoon as just another space for leisure and passing time, had become the stage for a lesson no one there would soon forget. Donald Trump's unexpected act of compassion in the park that day not only transformed Mark's life, but also sparked a wave of deep emotion among those who witnessed it. In that moment, when a powerful leader knelt beside a homeless veteran, a powerful message of empathy and the value of compassion was conveyed. The story quickly spread across media platforms and social networks, capturing the attention of people from all walks of life. Images and videos of Trump placing a hand on Mark's shoulder, listening intently to his story with sincere eyes, prompted millions to reflect. For people of faith, this story became a living testament to Christ's teaching in the Bible. Whatever you do for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you do for me. It reignited their belief that even the most powerful individuals can embody the love and compassion that God calls for. For Trump's supporters, this moment became a symbol of a different side of him, not just as a strong, decisive leader, but as a man with a heart capable of deep empathy. Many praised this act as proof that Trump had not forgotten those who sacrificed for the country, regardless of their circumstances. The story didn't end in the park that day. It ignited nationwide conversations about how society treats the less fortunate, particularly homeless veterans. Many began to ask, how could someone who once sacrificed so much for our freedom be abandoned like this? What must we, as a society, do to ensure that people like Mark never have to endure such pain alone? Charitable organizations and veteran support groups responded by launching new initiatives, pledging to provide more housing, jobs, and mental health services for struggling veterans. Some leaders called for reforms in veteran support systems, emphasizing that a single act of kindness, like Trump's, could serve as the spark for broader, systemic change. The story of Trump and Mark left behind a profound lesson. Compassion is not just a fleeting act, it is a force capable of changing lives. Mark, who once lived in the shadows of neglect, had now found a beacon of hope. More than that, he became a symbol of resilience and the belief that no matter how dire the circumstances, there is always an opportunity to start anew. Trump's final words in the park that day continued to echo in the minds of those who witnessed the moment. Kindness doesn't just change one life. It has the power to transform an entire community, a society, and even the world. Never pass up the chance to do good. And for everyone who heard this story, one truth became clear. Even the smallest acts of kindness, when born from the heart, can create monumental change.